Cisco Walker, an evangelist here in the beloved International District. And today we are going to be talking about rebellious youth is on the rise. Or is it? Right? This is this topic we're phrasing in the form of a question. I have Pastor Alonzo Garcia, New Life Church of God, with me again. It's always wonderful to sit down and try to hash these ideas out. I've chosen Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21. This is the thought division of the rebellious son. So Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 says this: If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So tonight we're talking about rebellious youth. And rebellious youth is on the rise, or is it? You know, recently APD Police Chief Harold Medina stated that violent crime, particularly among the younger generation or the youth, is on the rise. You know, some believe that this is a perennial error, right? In other words, a pattern that simply repeats itself throughout history over and over again. So, what do you think about this question tonight as it concerns the city of Albuquerque, the metro area, the youth in general here in America, that the rebellious youth is becoming more violent, more evil, more brutal? Are they really becoming that way, or has this something that has just always existed?
Well, Cisco, thank you for having me. I really do enjoy digging into these topics. Because sometimes it's important for us to say the quiet part out loud. I did some research in preparation for this topic, and I frankly was a bit surprised by the data. There is a statement in data that says data is ambivalent. Data management, data is ambivalent. Data doesn't care. It just represents whatever it represents. And so I think that the statement from Chief Medina, while I'm not going to say he's a liar, I'm going to say he's got it all wrong, I think that it is really narrow in its perspective, particularly in the United States at large. Because the data shows that that is not true.
Right.
So I think that it probably feels like it, right? Like I don't do police work. I don't keep track of how many people I've arrested in a year. I am not investigating crimes. I am not seeing, directly firsthand the violence. I'm not writing or, reports about it, making presentations to the city council. So maybe I am less biased. But it does appear to me that there is an element of a logical fallacy, recency bias, confirmation bias, a couple others.
Logical fallacy.
Yeah, there are some logical fallacies, meaning he thinks he's right because of what he believes is in front of him, right? And so that's the challenge with the logical fallacy. And so, when we get around to it, I did jot some of those statistics that I had looked up. That I'd looked up down, looking at that verse in Deuteronomy.
It seems kind of like I put that verse out there for like a shock value, because if if people aren't careful, especially older people, especially unchurched people, especially bitter and resentful people, like people can read that verse and they can be like, whoa, I wish we could go back to that again. Because if we could go back to that again, then we could clean up these streets. If we could go back to that again, we could get these youths by the scruff of their neck and we could clean up this town. We could clean up this world. If we could just go back to that. Oh, I wish we could just go back to that again. Because this verse is one of those cringy verses. This verse can be taken out of context, which if you just read it the way that I actually read it, it actually is taken out of context. It has many ties to prodigal son, all kinds of things, but a lot of people salivate and they'd love to go back to this time period. And this verse actually shows us, the Bible is roughly, 6,000 years old, 5,000 years old, maybe even older. So these problems have existed since the inception of time.
Sure. Yeah, I am pro-life, right?
Yes.
And I don't believe in, I can't tell someone what to do, but I don't support abortion, right? But I also don't support aborting those that are already born. And that's what that passage is often used to support, right? Like, these people are worthless. The fact that you refer to them as these people, right? Cleaning up the streets.
Yeah, and I said that
rid of the scum.
in the guise of,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But people say that and really mean it.
Yeah, they do. And Christians say it, and they really mean it as well. So those are things that we have to be careful with. So why is it so common among the older generation to gravitate towards the idea that the younger generation is more evil? The younger generation is more violent. The younger generation is more dangerous. And the younger generation is more depraved than the previous generation.
So I work in an office building, and there's an elevator and there's stairs. And for years, I'm not in the greatest of physical health, but I try and take the stairs, right? I don't park close, so I can walk. I take the stairs, not the elevator, because it's good for me. But the older I get, the more I worry when my heel drags on a step that I'm going to fall and break a hip. And I think maybe as we get older and we start to face some of our own mortality, I think there is that sort of response that is just a natural outflow. We become afraid of things that didn't bother us before, whether we were, thought we were bulletproof when we were kids, right? Or we just didn't understand the gravity that comes from hurting yourself, like falling down the stairs, right? Like, as a kid, I've fallen down the stairs and I was fine. I'm 52.
Yeah,
it's trying to fall down the stairs.
It's going to be like much different.
And that's
if you fall now.
That's a logical fallacy as well. It's recency bias. It's the things that have happened most recently to me that affect me the way that something in my own present life would affect me. So I struggle with that same logical fallacy. And so I think that's why older folks are going to look at the youth and say it's so much worse than it ever was. We're so much better at killing each other today than we ever were before. That's not exactly great.
Yeah, and the Bible tells us, Ecclesiastes 1:9, right? What has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun, right? And I'm not making a claim that the Bible is the only manuscript. I'm not making the claim that the Bible is the only manuscript that has the answers to all our problems. However, Scripture does help us understand that these problems have always been here and they will always be here because there is no utopia. And I think that when men and women, whether they're churched or whether they're unchurched, whenever we strive to create utopia is when things like this rebellious son begin to take place, like in the book of Deuteronomy. Whenever we strive to make utopia, we want to get all of the proverbial weeds out of the way, and we want to do people in. We want to be the person that hands out justice. We want to be the people that execute judgment. And I think that's very dangerous. But the pattern of youth And this is why we're going to be using tonight as well a majority of our thoughts that are going to come from Scripture, and they're going to come from Clockwork Orange. And why would so many Christians have a problem saying, well, how in the world could you use a book like Clockwork Orange to demonstrate biblical principles? Why do so many evangelicals have a problem making that connection?
It comes back to
Because that's a big deal, you know.
It is, but it's a topic you and I have discussed before. People are afraid of knowledge, right? Like they don't really want to learn anything; they just want to parrot things. They'll read Max Lucado, they'll read C.S. Lewis, but in reading C.S. Lewis, they'll get to the screw tape letters and it rattles them.
Yeah.
Right, and so some of those same folks are obsessed with, World War II, or studying serial killers, or any number of things, right? And people have the habits that they have.
Most evangelicals, or especially pastors, they're not going to look at serial killers. But I get your point.
Well, I
don't know any of them that are
Yeah,
interesting that would dare to look into that. I'm not saying that's healthy, but I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Though. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, they have obsession with things that
maybe they do it secretly.
Yeah, the people in Netflix and all those subscription services grow for a reason.
Yeah.
So here's just a little bit of data, just as we're sort of talking about things. Like I went back to 1960, right? I was born in 72. So in 1960, someone born in 1960 would have been 12. That's sort of that age of, accountability that we would see in the Bible and looking at it from an Old Testament perspective. So 1960, 11% of kids didn't have a parent, were single parent homes with absent fathers particularly. By 2010, that number had grown to 27%, right? So in 50 years, it had grown to 27%. But today, that number is below 27%. Now, some of that is there's not as many people having children.
Okay.
Right? And so, there is a piece of data that if you look at it from one perspective, you can make, and it might be a false cause, but you can say that, there are 25% of our kids today grow up in single parent, specifically absent father homes. What kind of impact does that have on crime? Well, another piece of data is that from 2019 to present, there have been the fewest number of youthful arrests under 18, 696,620 in 2019. There have been the fewest in 4 decades. So going back to 1979, right? So it's 1960 to 1979, those 20 years. In 2019, 6 years ago, that number was the lowest it had been in 4 decades.
Yeah. All right. Well, I can tell you from my childhood, from my pre-adolescence, like I grew up here in Albuquerque. I went to elementary school in the North Valley, and there was some kids that were. My grandmother lived on a dead-end street over by Hogadas. That's when Hogadas was actually there for troubled kids. Remember that, like in the 80s?
Yeah.
So they lived by. She lived on Belrose Avenue. It was a dead-end street, and I remember, growing up. On Belrose Avenue, and there was a group of young kids, right? And these young kids, like, they lived at the end of the dead end street, right. And they had taken the dead end sign, and they had turned it into Dead Kennedys. And I remember they had a tree house, and it had corrosion of conformity.
Oh yes, you see.
And they were smoking pot. They were doing drugs. They were drinking. I remember for Halloween they would dress up as the Warriors with the baseball. Because
my stars!
Well, they had all been in baseball, so they had, so they would walk around trick or treating I don't really know if they were trick or treating. I think they were bag snatching and bullying kids.
Right.
But they were dressed up with the makeup on, like the movie The Warriors. Mm-hmm. Right? And like I remember these kids, and like there was the punk rock affiliation, but I remember like those kids were always there. Mm-hmm. And I remember like we were always told, stay away from them by the adults. Stay away from those kids. Those kids are going bad. They're troublemakers. They're getting into trouble. And like the adults were right, because I remember in just a couple of years' time, like one of those kids, like I remember like some houses started getting broken into, and like graffiti with oi and like skinhead stuff started like popping up. And then I remember watching this young man. He was older than me, but like he began to change. And like I remember like he was into breakdancing and like all that kind of stuff, wore the parachute pants, kind of had the pompadour hair. But I remember that once he started really getting into that punk rock counterculture, like I remember seeing him like mowing the lawn, and like his head, and he was Hispanic, but his head was shaved. He had red suspenders on. He wore the boots and the braces. And like I remember those kids, like they were getting into trouble all the time. They severely they attacked. There was a 7-Eleven right there on the corner. Yep. Now it's a coffee shop, and I remember that one of those kids, he was a juvenile, and he went into that 7-Eleven and he punched the lady in the face. Then he went back home, got a baseball bat, came back, damaged the store, broke it all to pieces. And those young boys, it was rumored for years that like they had connections to Carlos the Ragman Garver's death. Remember, he was a street person who was these troubled youth. They poured accelerant on him and lit him on fire and burned him to death. And like there was never really nobody really knows who did it. I mean, somebody was charged, but it was a juvenile crime. So like some of these things, like I remember these things as a kid, like as a 9-10 years old, watching this cycle happen. But like here's the thing, it didn't happen to every teenager that lived on that street, but it did happen to some. Sure. And so when I read about Alex, Pete, George, and Dim, like it's easy for me to conceptualize that because like I didn't kind of grow up in a normal setting, and like I remember those things. I remember when those kids started getting into trouble, when the houses started getting broken into, people were getting beat up, and like there was like bad things happening. And but here's the key. That's what I love about Burgess, because Burgess talks about when Georgie, Pete, and Dim, when they go into the bar, right? Remember, and they give away all of their money because there's the old women that are in the bar and they need an alibi, right?
From a local bar.
Yeah, and the way that they're dressed. And then they talk about the girls that are in these places and how like they're wearing the motley wigs and their feature, the clothes and the lipstick that they're wearing. They accentuate their promiscuity, but at the same time they're still just kids. But they're doing these awful and terrible things. But it's always been like this. It isn't just something that just all of a sudden has come about just now in 2025, because I shared this with you a week ago. I was, playing on the street corner at Central in Utah. I see two young men walking around, probably not even 21 years old, wearing ski masks, like the Ted Bundy ski mask, like broad daylight, and like you got to be careful with that. Yeah. You got to be careful with that because like those kids are probably up to something. Like nobody walks around with a ski mask on, in the middle of the day, in a drug-fueled and a prostitution-filled neighborhood. Right. Like a young man that's in that predicament, that's walking around with a ski mask on, like the wheels are turning, and like you got to pay attention to things like that.
Yep. Yeah, as I was getting some of this stuff ready and going over notes, I was thinking, my son plays soccer, right? And like he's a good kid, right? Tender-hearted kid. But like he doesn't face playground violence like we faced. Like, and please hear me out. It was a terrible name, but there was a game that was, like dodgeball. They called it Smear the Queer, and it's a terrible name.
Oh, yeah.
I get it. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's okay, but like, you literally, it wasn't just like trying to, hit somebody, or, it wasn't like literal dodgeball. It was like, let me exact violence upon you and those, you remember those balls, right? The red
Yeah,
balls?
yeah.
Like, those things would leave a terrible mark on you.
Yeah.
And like, I grew up, playing that. Like, sometimes you get hit and like, you can't show emotion and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that is a violence that we don't have in this society. So like, it's almost that youth violence used to be so normalized it was not seen as violent, and that we have, through social custom or maturity or the way that we engage with people, the way that we're kinder and gentler, and like we seem to look out for one another more, like we don't abuse kids on the playground in that same way. So when there is violence, it seems that it's larger than maybe it really is, because we don't live with that daily violence anymore.
Yeah, because I remember being a kid, and I remember being on the playground, and I remember being punched in the face and stuff.
Dude.
And I remember like my son, my oldest son, like trying to, he was interested in boxing for a while, and I said, okay. I said, you know what? I said you can try it. I said, but you know what? I said, like, you're gonna get hit in the face, and like you're not gonna like it, and like that's
great.
what that is.
Yeah.
And it's like it looks cool, it sounds cool now, but it's like you have a hard time getting hit with a baseball, and then you're gonna get hit in the face. Like it changes things, and it changes you, and going through that. Going through those experiences, they're very traumatic, but they're like a part of life. But now, like, I think our kids, they face stuff with the social media, the trolls,
Yep.
these
Yep.
videos, like, so it's still there,
Yep.
they can still be embarrassed and shamed and humiliated, and and these things are so traumatic, they happen to kids, where it can drive them to like suicide, it can drive them into horrible deep depression, it can scar them and affect them for life, so it's moved from the playground more to like this kind of stuff with all of our narcissistic society. So there's nuances that have changed throughout the years, because I do remember those games, and I remember those same kids that were on my grandmother's street. Like, that was the first fight that I ever got into, because they lied and they wanted to see me fight. And so like I got in a fist fight with a little kid, and there was blood and everything. It was terrible, and but I wanted to impress them.
Yeah.
And I looked up to them, and I was like, well, these are adults, and if this is what they're doing, because you're so impressionable at that younger age, and it's so important to be, if you're a young person, when you're a young adolescent, that you're around the right type of people, because people can't twist your arm and make you do things, but we value and we care about what people think more than we like to admit, especially like when you're a kid. So this is what is so interesting about Burgess's book, is that they're doing all these things, but like, remember that he says here that he's doing all this stuff, and he's only 15 years old. Because if you watch the film, you see Malkovich, and Malkovich looks like he might be 19, 20. But when you read the book, you realize that Alex, George, Pete, and Dim, like, they're much younger. And like, they're doing really bad things, right? They're stealing cars, they're raping people, they're beating people, they're murdering. And they're doing awful, horrible things. And to them, it is fun, and there's no consequences really for it. And like, and so these patterns, this perennial error of, and that's one of the ways that you're getting old is when you think like these kids,
Kids nowadays.
you're turning into like Mr. Wilson, you're turning into this crotchety old man that doesn't want kids stealing cherries off of the cherry tree because you're turning into this rotten old bastard, and you see these kids as a nuisance, and and so like you always kind of, I think as an evangelical, you have to guard your heart against this. And like Medina can say those things, and I'm not for or against Medina. I'm kind of neutral for Medina. But when he makes statements like that, but I also understand that a man that has a badge, he has authority, and people listen to people like that. And that's one of the things, that's one of the major drawbacks to living in the 505, to living in the International District, watching Albuquerque Raw, watching Channel 7 and 4 all the time, is there's never anything good that comes on those news stations. But there's still good people in the city. Yeah. There's still good kids in the city. But you've got to be careful how you receive your information and who you receive it from.
Yep. Yeah, I don't watch any of those. I don't really watch TV. Like, I'm very selective about what I consume, and I tend to read more than I do watch. Like, I don't care what the weather is. Like, I figure out what the weather is when I walk outside.
Yeah.
Or if I happen to look out the window, I'm like, oh, there's snow on the ground.
Well, it's New Mexico.
Yeah,
it's not that drastic. Yeah.
It's not. But in that same regard, like, I also don't check the traffic before I hit the interstate, right? Or whatever I'm going. Like, if I end up running into a traffic jam, I don't hear about it on the radio. I don't hear about it on the news. I find out when, like, I'm like, oh, everybody's turning left. Right?
Yeah, like,
gotta get off this road.
This is kind of off subject, but what do you think about this? Why don't they go back to like old-fashioned police work? Like, start writing tickets, start pulling cars over that don't have tags. Like, we're the worst. We have the worst drivers in the United States. Whew. Like, why aren't they doing that? They want to worry about this and they want to worry about that. Like, people, they're all the cars, the distracted drivers, the DWI. Like, why don't they get back to that? Like, because like it's very dangerous to drive around the city of Albuquerque.
It's dangerous.
I know it's dangerous everywhere, but like specifically here, like there's people that I know that have lived in California. They've driven in Europe, and they're like, "This is the worst place I have ever driven in my life." Like, when is APD going to go back and start like doing? Because like when I was on drugs and when I was doing all kinds of, when I was a total scumbag, like you couldn't get, like you were going to get a ticket. If you didn't have tags, they were going to take that car. They were going to impound it.
Yep.
What happened to that?
I don't know. I will say this, that my dad was a police officer back in the 60s.
Okay.
And like I hear the stories of like, it was always bare knuckle brawls on the weekends, right? Like it was just the way of life. And it's kind of, in keeping with what we saw growing up. But it's dangerous to pull someone over today. Like
it is.
If you're a law enforcement officer, I mean, like you pull someone over because you can't see through their tint, and like you can't see through their tint, and then they shoot you.
Yeah, like, and they will,
and they have. Like a friend of mine, a guy I know really really well in another county where we're from. He just celebrated the other day the 20th anniversary of him getting shot 11 times.
Yeah, here in the 505.
Yep. In another county, but yeah.
Yeah, or here in the state of New Mexico.
Here in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah.
And it's like, you sort of take a step back and you're like, 11 times and you walked away. Like,
yeah.
I can't imagine the post-traumatic stress. And he was sheriff's deputy and retired from the sheriff's department.
Yeah.
I mean, like this individual put in the time and dealt with the psychological trauma of getting shot 11 times and left on the side of the road to die. He just didn't.
Yeah, awful. Now, we talked about Deuteronomy 21 verses 18 through 21, the rebellious son. Now, there's an interesting connection with our text and with Anthony Burgess's Clockwork orange scene. Now, this is an awful scene in the book. Many people have a problem with the Clockwork Orange because in order to understand Ludovico technique, in order to understand free will, you have to paint the picture of how bad Alex and his droogs really are, or really were in a fictional sense. So many people are turned off, which is understandably because even Kubrick said the first 20 minutes of his representation of Anthony Burgess's novel, which I think you have to have the two hand in hand.
They go well together.
You need the two hand in hand. They complement each other. They're not at odds. They're not against each other. But that first 20 minutes,
Burgess would disagree.
Burgess would, but and that's fine. But you have to understand why he needs treatment. You have to understand the ugliness, the vileness, the awfulness. You have to understand that, or else there's no reason for him to be cured.
Totally understand.
And we'll get into some of that later. But this is one of the scenes where Alex and his droogs, they break in. They force entry into a house. They beat. There's a couple there. He's a writer, and they beat him half to death, and they rape his wife, and it's awful and terrible. But this is interesting. Tell me what you think about this. It says, then Georgie and Pete came in from the kitchen, both munching away. Though with their maskies on, you could do that with them on and no trouble. Georgie with like a cold leg of something in one rooker, that's a hand, and half a loaf of Kleb with a big dollop of Maslow on it in the other, that's plum cake, and Pete with a bottle of beer, frothing its Gulliver off, and a horror show rooker full of like plum cake. Right? So like right there, you see the sign of drunkard and gluttony. That is there for a reason. That is there for a purpose. And I think that Christianity, these concepts of a drunkard and a glutton, like the reality and the testimony of Jesus Christ is so strong and so prevalent in our culture, in our society. And it's brilliant how it's put into this story with these young men as drunkards and gluttons. But the interesting thing about that is that Alex, clearly Georgie and Pete in the living room, cake and beer is a reference to a drunkard and a glutton. It's true that some of today's youth are filled with decadence, right? Right, with the turkey leg or whatever. The youth are filled with decadence and alcohol, pot, fentanyl, and it's just amazing to me how Burgess was able to put this in there. Christianity has a place in literature, in film, all the way down intrinsically to our thought process, whether you believe in Christ or not. And I marvel at the beauty and the brilliance of that.